The sheet music was on the stand in front of him. Then it wasn't. Louis Armstrong looked at it on the floor for 1 second. The band was still playing. The recording equipment was running. There was no way to stop and start over. Not in 1926, not with what a studio session cost. He opened his mouth, and something came out that had never been recorded before. The date was February 26, 1926. The place was OK Records in Chicago. The song was called Heebie-Jeebies. And what Louis Armstrong did when the paper hit the floor changed what the human voice was allowed to do in music. The story of how scat singing got its name, its shape, and its first recorded monument begins the way a lot of important things begin. By accident, under pressure, in a room where stopping was not an option. Armstrong had been in Chicago for 4 years by then. He had left New Orleans in 1922 at the invitation of King Oliver, the cornet player who had been something like a father figure since his early teens. He had played in Oliver's Creole jazz band, learned from one of the best musicians in the city, recorded his first sessions, and begun to understand the distance between what he could do and what everyone around him was doing. The distance was large. He was 24 years old and already playing things that other musicians stood still to listen to. He had also been pulled in directions that had nothing to do with growing. King Oliver was protective of his position. He gave Armstrong space, but not full space. The band showcased Oliver. Armstrong was the second cornet, which was where you put a musician you wanted close, but not ahead of you. By 1925, with encouragement from Lil Hardin, the pianist in Oliver's band who had become his wife and who saw his ability with a clarity that he didn't yet have about himself, Armstrong was recording under his own name. The Hot 5 sessions at OK were his band, his choices, his music. He was the one the microphone was pointed at. The February 26th session was supposed to produce a straightforward vocal number. Heebie-Jeebies was a novelty song, not deep material, not the kind of thing Armstrong would have chosen if he were choosing purely on artistic grounds. But it was what OK wanted, and Armstrong, in 1926, was still building the kind of leverage that would later allow him to say no to things. He was there to record the song as written. What happened to the sheet music has been told differently in different accounts. Armstrong himself gave different versions over the years. Sometimes the music fell, sometimes he accidentally knocked it. Sometimes he claims he simply forgot the words and improvised to avoid stopping. The details vary. The essential fact does not. Partway through the recording, Armstrong no longer had the written lyrics in front of him, and he did not stop. What he did instead was sing nonsense syllables. Not random sounds, but rhythmically precise, melodically shaped, emotionally inflected syllables that followed the logic of the song's structure while departing entirely from its words. He scatted. He made the voice into an instrument that played alongside the band rather than above it, responding and bending and finding intervals that the written lyric never would have found. The musicians in the room that day, by various accounts, stopped being musicians partway through and became listeners. The engineer running the recording equipment reportedly leaned forward. Whatever was happening at that microphone was not what anyone had come in expecting to hear. Vocal improvisation was not new. The blues tradition had been bending words and sounds for decades. Elements of scat had existed in African American musical culture going back further than anyone had formally recorded. Armstrong did not invent the concept from nothing. What he did was record it, give it a document, a form that could be heard and played again, studied and imitated and built upon. The record was the thing. Heebie-Jeebies was released, and it sold enormously. By the standards of a 1,926 recording, it was a phenomenon. 40,000 copies in its first weeks, an almost unheard-of number for a jazz record at the time. Musicians and singers across the country heard it and understood immediately that something had happened. Not everyone knew what to do with what they understood. Scat singing spread because it was on the record and people could hear it. But the full implications, that the voice could be freed from words entirely, could be its own improvising instrument, could do things in the moment that no written lyric would ever think to do, those implications took years to play out in the work of the singers who came after. Ella Fitzgerald, who would become the greatest scat singer in the history of jazz, heard Armstrong and heard the door open. Armstrong himself did not make a large claim about what had happened that February day. He was not a man who narrated his own significance. When he talked about heebie-jeebies in later interviews, he was characteristically light. He told the story as a funny accident, something that worked out. He described the scat passage as something he came up with on the spot because he had no choice. He seemed genuinely unconcerned with the question of whether it was historically important. But musicians were not unconcerned. They heard the record, and they heard what it opened. They heard a man at a microphone in a Chicago studio in 1926 making a decision not to stop, not to apologize, not to reach for the fallen paper, and singing through. Singing something that had no words because words were not available, and the music was. There is a principle in jazz that has been articulated in many ways by many musicians. The mistake is not a problem if you commit to it. If you play the wrong note and then build on it, follow it, let it lead somewhere it wasn't supposed to go, it stops being a mistake. It becomes a choice. It becomes the music. What Armstrong did on February 26, 1926, was apply that principle to the voice. He had no choice about the sheet music being on the floor. He had every choice about what to do in the moment after. He chose to sing. He chose not to stop. He chose to make the voice do what instruments do: improvise, respond, find the next thing without knowing in advance what it was. The recording exists. You can listen to it now. You can hear the moment when the words stop and something else begins. When Louis Armstrong, 24 years old, in a Chicago studio with fallen sheet music at his feet, opens his mouth and the voice goes somewhere it had never publicly gone before. 40,000 copies in the first weeks, then more. Then the musicians who heard it and understood. Then Ella Fitzgerald, who heard the door. Then everyone who came after Ella. Then the entire tradition of vocal jazz improvisation, which runs in a direct line from a February afternoon in 1926, when a piece of paper fell off a music stand in Chicago. Louis Armstrong looked at the paper on the floor for 1 second. Then he sang, and the music was never quite the same again.